So welcome back. Last time we were looking at some of the mistakes of the history of logical theory, and then in this next section, Dewey is going to introduce his theory of inquiry, which we're going to use to kind of create a new system of logic, a new kind of logical theory. So let's get into it. So Dewey writes, when the methods and results of inquiry are studied as objective data. So again, we're going to be studying how inquiry works, so the methods and results of inquiry, of looking into something, analyzing something, figuring out what's going on, trying to solve a problem. So when those methods and results are studied as objective data, the distinction that has often been drawn between noting and reporting the ways in which men do think and prescribing the ways in which they ought to think takes on a very different interpretation from that usually given. So Dewey is here just mentioning a common distinction in philosophy between a descriptive approach and a prescriptive approach. You see this, for example, in ethics. What do people actually do? What do people actually think is right? And what should we actually do? What should we think is the right thing to do? And with logic, there's a descriptive and prescriptive approach too, or you could take a traditionally descriptive and prescriptive approach. What do people actually, how do people actually think? How should they actually think? The usual interpretation is in terms of the difference between the psychological and the logical, the latter consisting of norms provided from some source wholly outside of and independent of experience. So the usual interpretation of descriptive prescriptive is between psychological, something psychological or inner, how do people think, and the logical of something existing outside. And Dewey has critiqued this idea of logic as something outside of or beyond experience that then we somehow have access to and can impose on experience. And that would be the prescriptive side. And this is what Dewey calls the usual interpretation, and of course it's not going to be Dewey's interpretation. So he says, the way in which men do think, men, and when I say men, when Dewey says men, of course, just assume he means people. The way in which men do think denotes, as it is here interpreted, simply the ways in which men at a given time carry on their inquiries. So far as it is used to register a difference from the ways in which they ought to think, it denotes a difference like that between good and bad farming or good and bad medical practice. That's an interesting way of putting it. So we're not really making a difference between, making a distinction between what men actually, or what people actually do and what they ought to do, but between something done well and something done badly. And we're trying to get to a place where things are done well, where logic is done well, for example, where inquiry is done in a way that makes it successful, rather than in a way that makes it unsuccessful or less successful. So men think in ways they should not when they follow methods of inquiry that experience of past inquiries shows are not competent to reach the intended end of the inquiries in question. And you might think, we don't do this. It would be silly to keep doing something that experience has shown doesn't work. But I think we can all think of patterns of behavior in our lives that are not successful, and yet we keep doing them. It's, can be a matter of habit, where you get stuck in a certain way of doing something, even though it's not optimal, even though it doesn't give you a good outcome. But, you just maybe don't think about it, or it's part of your habit, or you're blind to it, the fact that you keep doing this thing unsuccessfully. And that can happen at a society-wide level as well. It can happen at a personal level where we get stuck in these patterns of behavior that kind of block us from solving our problems in a actually helpful way. Going on, Everybody knows that today there are in vogue methods of farming generally followed in the past which compare very unfavorably in their results with those obtained by practices that have already been introduced and tested. When an expert tells a farmer he should do thus and so, he's not setting up for a bad farmer an ideal drawn from the blue. He is instructing him in methods that have been tried and that have proved successful in producing results. And this would be a contentious example today, especially that now that we've seen experts fail in various ways in the history since Dewey's time. I think we would be right to be more skeptical of what Dewey is calling experts, but I think the general point is valid. So if someone who's actually studied a number of different farming methods is trying to instruct someone who's maybe only done things in a certain way because that's the way their parents did it and that's the way their parents' did it and so on, then we're talking about someone who has a basis for saying maybe what's better and what works better and what doesn't, right? If you have many things to compare and you've tested them in many different situations, you have a better idea of what's going to work than someone who just has been doing the same thing their whole life and hasn't had the experience of comparing it to other ways of doing things. So I think that's valid, even though we might question experts more today than we might have in Dewey's day of the 1930s. So he's instructing him, the expert is instructing the bad farmer in methods that have been tried and that have proved successful in procuring results. In a similar way, we are able to contrast various kinds of inquiry that are in use or that have been used in respect to their economy and efficiency in reaching warranted conclusions. So now applying this farming case to inquiry, right? Some modes of inquiry are more efficient. They get you there in a more economical way, and so on. We know that some methods of inquiry are better than others in just the same way in which we know that some methods of surgery, farming, road making, navigating, and whatnot are better than others. So Dewey is putting inquiry on the same level as many other practical activities. Some just are better than others, and this doesn't mean that they're ultimately better than others, but in a given situation and in a given time, we can recognize that certain things work just better than others, and we may revise that later on, but it's an always ongoing process. I don't think Dewey would see one way of doing inquiry as ultimately better, but we can make improvements over time and even change direction if we find out later on that we're on the wrong path, have gone down the wrong path in controlling our inquiries. We can branch off and go in a different direction, just like we can with farming. I think farming is an interesting example because there's been so many different developments in farming, and we've learned that some things we thought were good are actually not good, and so on and so on. So it's always revisable, but we do want to try to make progress in improving our methods of inquiry and doing all these other stuff, right? Surgery is another really good example because we have found out, seemingly for sure, that certain things you ought to do, like wash your hands in between surgeries and stuff like that. Let's continue though. I think you get the point. So, Dewey continues, it does not follow in any of these cases that the quote-unquote better methods are ideally perfect or that they are regulative or quote-unquote normative because of conformity to some absolute form. So, I was just saying this, basically making the same point that Dewey was just going to make. They are the methods which experience up to the present time shows to be the best methods available for achieving certain results, while abstraction of these methods does supply a relative norm or standard for further undertakings. Right? So I guess the key word is relative. We can find methods that are relatively better than past methods and keep making improvements or branch off into different directions from there. But we begin with that new and improved way as a kind of relative norm for the future, for future undertakings. Going on, the search for the pattern of inquiry is, accordingly, not one instituted in the dark or at large. It is checked and controlled by knowledge of the kinds of inquiries that have and that have not worked, methods which, as was pointed out earlier, can be so compared as to yield reasoned or rational conclusions. So we're not going to just blindly choose this or that pattern of inquiry as our model. We're going to take a look at what has worked, what has not worked well in the past, and use that to control our understanding of the pattern of inquiry. For through comparison-contrast, we ascertain how and why certain means and agencies have provided warrantably assertable conclusions, while others have not and cannot do so in the sense in which cannot expresses an intrinsic incompatibility between means used and consequences attained. So some methods of inquiry just do not match means and ends. We follow those means and we don't get a conclusion that we like. And there may be different degrees here, right? We follow a certain method and we get better or worse results. And there could be degrees of better and degrees of worse. But we have to compare and contrast, right? You have to have multiple things. You can't just take things in isolation and say, well, this is good, this works. You compare it and see how much better it works than something else, if it works better than something else at all. Continuing on, we may now ask, what is the definition of inquiry? That is, what is the most highly generalized conception of inquiry which can be justifiably formulated? The definition that will be expanded directly in the present chapter and indirectly in the following chapters is as follows. All right, so this is going to be Dewey's big definition of inquiry. We want to get this into our heads. So let's go. Inquiry is the controlled or directed transformation of an indeterminate situation into one that is so determinate in its constituent distinctions and relations as to convert the elements of the original situation into a unified whole. All right, now that's going to be complicated the first time you hear it, and we're going to get various elaborations of that. We'll get some details about what all these different parts of this this definition mean. Just to give some kind of a brief gloss on it. So we're trying to transform in a controlled way, so not just randomly, but in a controlled way, by using previous knowledge, for example, and various other tools at our disposal. So we're going to be acting in a controlled way to change an indeterminate situation, a situation where we don't really know what's going on, into a determinate situation, a situation where we do know what it is. We do know what's happening. We know what the cause is. We're able to fix it into that kind of a situation where, maybe we start out with these different elements. We don't know how they are related to each other. We don't know how they should fit together, and we end up with a situation where we've fitted things together into a satisfying way, a way that works for us, right? Again, it's not a final thing. It could turn out to have unforeseen consequences or new problems that we've created, but the idea is we want to get from a situation where we are less certain of what's going on to a situation where we're more certain about what it is. I'll give you an example, maybe after I get through this next paragraph, which we're going to end on in this video. But so let me, maybe I'll read this next paragraph, trying to shoehorn in an example where I can. So the original indeterminate situation is not only open to inquiry, but it is open in the sense that its constituents do not hang together. All right, so here's maybe a good place to insert an example. So as an example of an indeterminate situation, let's take the example where you walk into a room You flip the light switch, but nothing happens. The light doesn't come on. So you expect the light to come on, but it doesn't come on. That's the confusing situation. So what is going on, right? There may be many different things going on. There may be many possible explanations for what is happening, but at the beginning you don't know. You're in an indeterminate situation. I push this light button, the light should go on, but it did not go on. The determinate situation, on the other hand, qua outcome of inquiry, is a closed and, as it were, finished situation or universe of experience. So when I fixed the problem, when I figured out what was going on, the situation is finished. It's closed, right? So let's say it's something as simple as that the light bulb burned out. So I try that, I replace the light bulb, push the switch again, light goes on. It's a finished situation. It's determinate now. Oh, so that was the problem. Problem solved. Okay, we know what was going on. But maybe that doesn't work, right? Maybe you change the light bulb, but the light still doesn't come on. There could be other, multiple other explanations for what's going on. In that case, the situation is still open. It's still indeterminate. The parts don't hang together, right? The part of putting on the light, turning on the light doesn't come on. Those don't fit together, right? They're still separated. We haven't figured out the right relationship yet. And then controlled or directed in the above formula refers to the fact that inquiry is competent in any given case in the degree in which the operations involved in it actually do terminate in the establishment of an objectively unified existential situation. I find this sentence to be confusing. I've read through it a number of times. So when he talks about the above formula, I think he's talking about up here. Inquiry is the controlled or directed transformation. He gives other explanations of controlled and directed. Here he makes it, the way he says this makes it sound kind of circular. It's controlled if the situation gets solved, which, you could solve a situation randomly. So I think that's not what he means, or I'm not sure how to interpret this sentence. But yeah, controlled or directed, the inquiry is controlled or directed, I think, in the sense that you may rely on past inquiries that have worked, right? You're not just taking a stab at it. You're not just throwing out random ideas and choosing randomly from among those. You might, brainstorm kind of random things, but then you're looking at what's the most likely one, what has most likely worked in the past, what is most likely the case in this situation. Let's try this first. This doesn't work, then let's try this. So I would give that kind of explanation of controlled or directed, and oppose it maybe to, uncontrolled, of course, or maybe, random or arbitrary, things like that. In the intermediate course of transition and transformation of the indeterminate situation, discourse, through the use of symbols, is employed as means. And Dewey often likes using these little, I don't know if it's a pun exactly, but he likes pointing out the relationships between certain words. So the intermediate course of transition and transformation, we use discourse. Discourse is part of our course from the indeterminate to the determinate situation. For example, the light switch thing, you think through various problems. I've done this a number of times in that situation or similar situations. You think to yourself, well, is it the light bulb? Is it the fuse? Is it the fuse box? Is it, sometimes here they are working on the electricity on the street and they shut down the electricity in your building for a while. Did someone shut down the electricity? Is it the wiring? We've had that problem. So there's all these different problems that it could be, but you think through it in discourse and think, what is it likely to be? Which one should I check first? Which one is easiest to check maybe, or the quickest to check? And then you go on to the ones that get more and more involved, at least in this kind of situation. That's what I've found works best. Start with the most likely and easiest possibilities, and then get to the more unlikely and more complicated ones. All right. Anyway, in received logical terminology, propositions or terms and the relations between them are intrinsically involved. So discourse is going to be an important intermediary in at least human problem solving. All right, and then in the next parts of this chapter, I'm going to stop here, but the next parts of this chapter will get more in depth into these different parts of the pattern of inquiry. All right, so that's all for this one. Thank you for listening.